So far we've been dealing with workbooks that have already been opened, but most of the time in the real world you'll have to open the workbook. You don't want to rely on the user to have to open a workbook before the macro runs. Now we can use the workbook's open property, and indeed that's what we will be using. However, there's a few issues with opening the file. The file may be already opened or the file may not exist, so we have to check for these items. Now the good news is I already have a function here that does all this. So these two functions check that the file exists and they also check if it's already open. So you do not have to write this code again. All you need to do is take this file from the downloads at the end of this section, and then you can use this code yourself. And now this lesson will be all about how you can use it. So again, we've declared a workbook and we just set the workbook to the return value of open workbook, which is the function that we just looked at. And all we need to do is supply a file name and tell the function if we want the file to be read-only or if we want it to be opened as not read-only. So in other words, that we can write to it. So let's go ahead and run this code. Now you can see that book 3 opened fine. So now let's try and open this again. So when we run this a second time, you can see we now get an error because it's detected that the workbook is already open. So it asks us to close the file and try again. Now a second type of error that's very common is if we spell the name wrong, or if the folder name has changed, or if the file no longer exists. And this will give us this error: the workbook could not be found. So as you can see, opening a workbook is very straightforward when you use this code. So now let's do something with the workbook when we open it. When we open the workbook, BK now points us to the workbook that we've opened, so we can do something with it. So let's just print out its name to the immediate window. And so it opened the file, and when we opened the immediate window, you can see that the name was there. Now there was already a name there already, but it printed out book3.xlsm. So now the important thing to keep in mind, if we run this code again, we'll run into a problem. And the reason for this is that we're going to get an error because the file is already opened. So we don't get back any workbook from the function. So you can see here, if we highlight BK, you can see it says object variable or with block variable not set. And this means it hasn't been set to a variable. So when we try to use this now, we'll get an error. Object variable or with variable not set, which was pretty much the same thing it was saying. So what we have to do when we write code is protect against these type of errors. So what we say is, and this is standard for all objects, we say if not the object is nothing. And this means if the object is something. In other words, if the object has been set to something. And it's always phrased like this. So in other words, if the object is set to something, then print debug, otherwise don't do anything. So you can see the error disappeared this time because it didn't try to print the name. Now this time we've closed the file and we won't get an error. It'll open correctly. And you can see that it printed out the name correctly to the immediate window. So as you can see, using this open workbook function makes opening workbooks very straightforward. Sometimes in your macros, you'll want to allow the user to select the workbook to use. And this is actually quite easy to do. We use the application file dialog. So let's have a look at this code. You can see this function I've written already, and in this function it uses the file dialog and it sets the filter and the title of the file and allows the user to select a file. Now if you want to select one file, you can just use this function. You don't need to rewrite this code, or you don't even need to understand it. So this lesson will show you how you can use this function. Now later in this section of the course, I'm going to have a lesson that shows you how you can include all these functions in your macros or in the workbook that you're currently using. So to use this function, the first thing we need is a variable of type string. So this is where we're going to store our file name. So we simply set file name to equal this function. And this function again is called user select workbook. And once we do this, then the function will take care of the rest. It will open the file and allow the user to select the workbook. So adding comments to the code always makes it neater and easier to read. So here we can see the first thing we do is we get the file name, and the second thing then we open the file. Now we no longer have a string here, instead we have the file name that we've opened. So whatever file name the user gave us, we can use this to open. So you can see this gives us a lot of flexibility because we can open any file that the user selects. So here we've run this and you can see the dialog. So we click OK and select report as our file. So now I've just stopped the code here, so let's have a look in the locals window. So you can see that we now have the full name of the report in our file name variable. So it has the path and the file name. So now that we have this, we can just use this as an argument for open workbooks. So let's run it on. And it's now opened the workbook. So we can just have a look at this even. So you can see that our workbook has opened. So you can see here that this is actually very simple to use. You don't need to understand user select workbook. And by just using 2 lines of code and 2 lines of declaration, we can allow the user to select the file using the dialog, and then we can open that file. In this lesson, we're going to look at copying a module from one workbook to another. And this is useful when you have modules which have some useful functions in them. So the first way we'll do it is by creating a new module. And now we'll just rename that module to something like utils. So let's select View and Properties Window, or F4. So now we'll just change the name here and we'll just call it utils. So now we can go to the source code that we want and we can just select everything here. So we do this by pressing Ctrl A or just Edit Select All, and this highlights everything. And now we can just copy and then go back to our utils and just paste the code. And now we have all the code that we require. Now a much better way of doing this is if we export and import. So let's just show a look at how we'll do this. So we go to our workbook utils and we right click on utils and select export. So export file. And now we can just save this as a .bas file somewhere. And so we just click OK and we've got this saved. So now anytime we want to use this module anywhere, all we need to do is right click on the workbook where we want to use it and we select import file and we just select this file. So we just select the folder where the file is and we just click on this file and click open, or just double click on it, and you can see now that it's part of book 1. So we'll create a new module just to test that this code still works fine. So we'll copy this code here. So this is just a simple function for opening the workbook, and we'll place it in our book 1. And remember, book 1 is where we've imported our workbook utils. So let's run this and see if the code works fine. So we run the code and you can see now that book3.xlsm opened fine. So this lesson was just showing you how to copy a module from one workbook to another, and as you can see, it's actually very straightforward.